were written. King and some of his followers were arrested in 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama for what was deemed to be an illegal march. From King's jail cell, he wrote this essay called Letters from Birmingham Jail, which defended the strategy of nonviolent protests to end racism. This set the precedent for what the rest of the civil rights movement protests were going to be.
According to the article entitled SCLC History, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was formed in 1957 by Martin Luther King Jr. It organized ministers and churches in the South to get behind the civil rights struggle and advocate for equal rights through the use of nonviolent protests. Martin Luther King was the president of this conference, and the main job of the SCLC was to help run and plan the nonviolent protests in the civil rights movements. Another reason for MLK's induction into the Hall of Fame is the Memphis sanitation workers' strike. According to an article entitled What Did MLK Do to Progress the Civil Rights Movement? In 1968, 1,300 black sanitation workers were protesting terrible working conditions, discrimination, and low pay in Memphis, Tennessee. The strike began on February 12th and lasted 64 days and eventually became one of the major civil rights events. Martin Luther King came to Memphis to speak and support the Second March of the Sanitation Workers. The American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees helped the sanitation workers fight to end discrimination, receive higher wages, and gain union recognition. The national news was attracted along with local members of the community. The strike ended on April 12th, and the city of Memphis agreed to the workers' demands.
The Montgomery bus boycott began in 1955 when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a city bus to a white man. She was arrested, and this sparked a mass movement of African Americans who were led by Martin Luther King to boycott the city buses. This boycott lasted for 13 months, and eventually it did result in the end of the racist law that allowed segregation on city buses.
In August of 1963, Martin Luther King led one of the largest and most successful demonstrations in U.S. history. Around 200,000 blacks and whites took part in the peaceful March on Washington in support of a civil rights bill. The highlight of the march was Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, which called for the end of racial prejudice and ended with everyone in the crowd singing, "We shall overcome." Above is an excerpt from page 5 of the famous I Have a Dream speech. This is one of the most well-known speeches in history and has helped shape Martin Luther King's legacy as the leader of the civil rights movement.
How did the ideas of MLK shape the civil rights movement in today's world?
So a lot of, one thing that Martin Luther King did was, really trying to push awareness of the issue. One of the biggest things was the marches, and I think that the March on Washington and the march from town to town is something that you can see now with the March for Our Lives, the Women's March, and showing the kind of world of what the issue is and showing the solidarity of it.
Awesome, thank you. And then my next question is, in your opinion, what is the most influential thing Martin Luther King did during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s?
So I have two. One is, I think, the Montgomery bus boycott and being a big organizer and kind of backer of that, and because of showing the power of a boycott and power of economy can be to push an issue. Also, the March on Washington, of course, and the hugeness of that. I went to the Civil Rights Museum and saw some really amazing things about that, and kind of the background of the speech and how profound that was, and how many people you had there, and how it being such a nonviolent movement and show of solidarity and something that's continued today, and that legacy is there today.
According to the history engines, the Maysville Road Act was a plan to build a transportation road within the Midwest, primarily in Kentucky. President Jackson vetoed this because he believed it was the state's rights to determine if or if not they wanted the road to be built. This was bad because this disrupted trading routes, or trading from the east to the west, which overall hurt America's economy.
According to USHistory.com, the spoils system was Jackson removing 20% of federal officials and replacing them with political officers that agreed with Jackson's perspectives. This shows President Jackson abusing his platform within the executive branch. President Jackson created the Indian Removal Act that required the relocation of Native Americans west of the Mississippi River. This act led to the Trail of Tears, which was the migration of 15,000 Cherokee members moving westward. This also killed 4,000 Cherokee members. President Jackson took away the human rights of Native Americans and created the disrespect for Native Americans throughout history.
Another reason why President Jackson should be put into the Hall of Shame is because of the pet banks. Jackson took money from the second bank, which was a national bank, and put it into all the states' banks. These are all known as pet banks. This was bad for the economy because when citizens wanted to take the money out of the pet banks, they were unable to. This led to the Panic of 1837 and overall hindered the economy.
Congress placed the Tariff of Abomination in 1828. Because states have the rights, South Carolina legislation declared the tariff as unconstitutional. The nullification crisis led to the Force Bill. The Force Bill allowed President Jackson to utilize the military in South Carolina so that the legislation would start following the tariff. This showed President Jackson abusing his executive power because his uses of the military and Navy. This photo here is the Force Bill, Section 2, that clearly states that the president has the right to use naval and military powers within the United States if necessary.
Yeah.
Okay. How did Andrew Jackson carrying out the Indian Removal Act affect Native Americans' rights throughout history and in today's society?
Native Americans, when they were removed from their land, which they had traditionally lived on and, had been on for centuries, and being pushed west of the Mississippi River, this is something that's going to continue our government's policy of Native American persecution. We can just take their land, they're not that important. And it makes it okay. If the president and the U.S. government's doing it, well, it's okay for everyday citizens to act and react to Native Americans the same way. We're going to see the reservation system eventually come out of this. It's going to hinder the Dawes Act, which will take those reservation lands and make them homesteads, and it destroys the culture of Native Americans throughout that time period, and even into today, those cultures, the people who still know those traditions and ideas are a very, very small number.
Great. Okay, and then our last question is, what do you think was Andrew Jackson's worst policy, act, or program created under his presidency?
Well, the Indian Removal Act, as we just said, was pretty devastating to Native Americans into even today. But the spoils system that he used was something that he started this idea of giving his friends and his supporters jobs, and they might not be the best people for those positions, and we see that continue with other presidents through the 1800s and even into the 20th century. That people who really aren't well equipped to do the best job possible for our country, and many times doing things that benefited only them or another small group of individuals. So him beginning to say, okay, this is all right, give friends the jobs and give your supporters the jobs. That's something that was a big problem and continued for quite a while.